Good morning, everyone. Hi. I'd like to introduce you to the most exciting MiFID panel we have at the moment.
We're the only MiFID panel.
The only MiFID panel, indeed, that we have at the moment. The way that we've done this, we want this to be quite interactive, a bit more human in how we run this one. So kindly, a lot of you have logged in and voted on the first question. I'm going to ask the panellists to introduce themselves and what they do, and maybe give you a couple of minutes or a couple of seconds of thought about how and what MiFID means to them on a daily basis. A lot of us, it impacts us on our day-to-day to a lesser or greater extent, but to the panellists, what it means to them on their average day. So if I could start at the far end with Tony.
Thanks, Chad. So Tony Kirby, I am the regulatory reform lead at Ernst & Young. What MiFID II means to me on a daily basis means a lot of grey hair, a lot of sleepless nights, but more seriously, it's 222 days to go, including all holidays, all weekends, and everything else. It includes a lot of very, very deep, in-depth discussions with project teams, because most firms out there are in very deep execution, Chad. It also means, and this is not immediately apparent, constant challenges from businesses that have to manage their costs, manage their complexities. They want to know a couple of things. They want to know, show me exactly where in MiFIR or where in MiFID II the text describes that they've got to do such a thing and by a certain date. Secondly, they also don't really want to be outliers. There are about, from the buy-side perspective, which is really my client base, I'd say 17% of all the firms that I'm tracking in my surveys, they do want to be strategic and focused. They do want to be leaders. But for the majority of firms, they don't necessarily want to be outliers. They certainly don't want to overspend in terms of regrets-type work. So they're trying to get it right. Last comment, they're obviously mindful of other cross-regulations. There are various regulations, Payment Services Directive, Insurance Distribution, Benchmark, and especially General Data Protection Regulation this time next year. They want to be mindful of that, and they're mindful of Brexit. So we're the big picture.
Thank you, Tony. Arjun, if you'd like to have a couple of words.
Arjun Singh Michel, I'm the Global Head of Regulatory Affairs at TPI CAP. What MiFID means to me is, it's taught me different meanings of words I thought I knew I understood, such as, what does public mean? Well, public can now have different meanings. And what does simultaneous mean? Well, simultaneous can mean many different things. It doesn't necessarily mean at the same point in time. It can also mean within 3 hours or 2.5 hours. And so it's taught me how to innovate, not just, of course, in how clients interact with our trading venues, but also innovate new meanings of the English language, which I thought was, fairly simple and standardized, but I guess it's not. At the same time, of course, it's also, what MiFID means to me is spending a lot of time in steering committee meetings and working groups and creating program plans and so on, but also, it also means trying to understand why, as reported in the press today, why is Norway allowed to delay the implementation of MiFID? Why is Germany permitted to have a transitional until June of 2018, and but other jurisdictions are not? So what it's also taught me is there seem to be, again, different interpretations of what implementation date or go live means. So that's what MiFID means to me, in effect.
Thank you, thank you. James, you've recently joined Citi from a large UK infrastructure. How's that change been in terms of your perspective on MiFID?
Thank you, Chad. So my name's James Bohr. I head up market structure for the European equity business at Citi. The transition, a lot of people ask me that question, and it hasn't actually been as drastic as I thought, or perhaps others thought it might be. Apart from, as I said to Chad before, getting out of bed, having had 3 months garden leave was a struggle enough, let alone starting a new job, but that's by the by. Look, I think that the way in which I look at MiFID and how it impacts my day-to-day, my responsibilities are really focused on liquidity provision and what our liquidity strategy is, and thereby anything that is impacting that liquidity strategy around regulation, around MiFID II is what keeps me very busy. And I essentially split my time, I would say 75% of the time is actually out on the street talking to our clients and articulating to those clients what our liquidity strategy is. And that in itself is a huge challenge, and I'm sure we'll touch on a couple of these topics. The environment remains fluid with those 222 plus days till MiFID 2 go live. We should be locked down. We should be ready to go in the next couple of months. But the practicality of that and the fact that we're still waiting for questions to be answered from the regulators is troubling, to say the least. The other aspects I think that I spend a lot of time on is really trying to answer some very specific direct questions around things like best execution, trade transaction reporting, research unbundling, and no disrespect to Tony, but there are some very good consultants out there getting our client base all very excited and worked up on many of these topics, and I then have to unpick some of those challenges. So I'll pause for breath there.
Hey, don't worry, he's been here too. And Simon, obviously the biggest impact for you from MiFID 2 has been the change from your photograph to your current day appearance. But
I'd like to say that was an old photograph. Unfortunately, that's only about 18 months old. It's been a hard 18 months. I'm Simon Andrews. I'm an executive director in our regulatory affairs team here at Standard Chartered. What MiFID 2 means to me, most transparently, is a lot of sleepless nights, or very little sleep. I think a lot of the things that the other panelists have mentioned, I think, are probably fairly typical. I think the other things that I've sort of particularly found myself facing are questions which don't have answers, and areas where you need to take a view, where there are gaps, and with sort of 222 days left, you can't wait for the answers to come out. Someone has to come up with a view and interpretation. A way forward for in my case, for the bank, and ultimately be prepared to sort of put their name to it and give everyone else comfort that at least someone who is familiar with the rules is coming to an interpretation that everyone else can sort of fall in behind. So there's a lot of that involved. Probably leads to the sleepless nights. I actually had a dream the other week that one of the project implementation team had crashed my car. I'm sure that's hoping that's not prophetic. I mean, again, with a sort of Standard Chartered perspective, for my role is involving a lot of travel, trips out to Singapore, trips out to New York, because among the many areas where the rules are not as clear as we would like, is of course the question of global reach. And there are mixed views as to what the global impact and the extraterritorial scope of certain requirements are. Some of them are explicit, particularly around the reporting space. Some of them are perhaps more implicit. Some of them we have had to negotiate with the FCA to make sure that they are comfortable with the view we're taking. And again, that's something that I'm obviously involved in. And others are just areas where we have to take a view based on what we feel is in the best interests of the market, of our clients, and consistent with the sort of growing direction of different regulatory change programs, not just MiFID, obviously, but all of the many issues that I think Tony mentioned earlier.
Brilliant. Thank you. So we've asked our first audience question, which was to rate the in-house knowledge around the subject of MiFID. In excess of 90% are not fluent. Martin kindly provided the stat that we're 222 days away from go live. Do you think that's concerning that more people aren't further up the curve, particularly in a room full of what would be practitioners? And how do you think this bodes well for implementation? I'm going to put the next question up, so if you could start to answer, folks. Who in the audience would like to? On the panel would like to take that one.
I'll kick off, if I may. There's another thing which is slightly concerning, which is only emerging right now. So very sympathetic to some of the comments, particularly what you were saying there, James, in terms of, if I compare MiFID 2 v MiFID 1, which we lived through about 10 years ago and a bit, there was always the chance of going to the then FSA or HM Treasury, etc., and you'd get a clear answer. It was much simpler scope. With MiFID 2, clearly there's a major delta, whether we're talking governance, investor protection, including research, the markets provision, the reporting, and the extraterritoriality that, I just about said that right, extraterritoriality that Simon was mentioning. But we're tending to forget that there are vendor suppliers out there that equally have to be ready. In the buy-side, major order management system and execution management system providers, they've got to be aligned. We also mustn't forget about the fact that the reference data assignation, the ISINs and the legal entity identifiers also have to be ready for day one. Unless I've heard to the contrary, and Arjun, please correct me, the FCA is holding to the position if you don't have an LEI, you don't trade. That's a very, very sharp shock. Whether you're allowed, obviously, some degree of forbearance if the LEI is not available or the ISIN for the derivative not available, that I don't know. But there are some major questions of a very practical nature that have to be asked. And I rather suspect that the easy bits of MiFID II, Chad, the sort of governance investor protection side, really quite well nailed down, maybe costs and charges not nearly so much, or maybe research not so much. But when it comes to the market stuff and when it comes to the data behind the reporting requirements, big questions there. So I don't know what the views are of others on the panel on that.
Yeah, I mean, you touched upon mandatory LEIs. This has been known for a couple of years, broadly accepted. It was protested against at the time, but we're now stirring down the barrel of that no trade policy. Anybody on the panel like to share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll chip in there, Chad. This is is a conversation we've had many times. Yeah, I mean it's a particular challenge, and it's obviously it's not unique to reporting under MiFIR. It crops up actually slightly sooner than that for the revised EMIR reporting. And I know there are a few people in the room who are very familiar with EMIR. It's a challenge. I think that has been. I think there are two main reasons why it's a challenge. First of all, it's probably not been an area that the industry as a whole has focused on until now. I think it's starting to top a number of lists of conversations. But 2-3 months ago, people probably weren't that concerned about it. So it's a challenge in that it's quite late in the day for firms to be looking at this and really considering the implications. So the window for any kind of advocacy work on this is well and truly closed. In fact, it's a requirement in the level 1 text. For MiFIR to have an LEI as part of your reporting. The other reason I think it's a challenge for a number of firms is that this is one of those areas that has a very definite extraterritorial scope. In mandating the use of LEIs for transaction reporting, European policymakers haven't just created a new obligation for European banks with European clients. They've also created that same obligation, effectively imposing that obligation on non-European clients of European investment firms. And that, I think, is something that European policymakers, the Parliament, the Commission, really had not thought about, or the implications of when they imposed that requirement. It's something that we are starting to hear from regulators outside of Europe, that they are concerned about what this might mean, among other things in MiFID II that are also a concern, trading obligations being an example. But there is a growing awareness globally that Europe is sort of mandating something that is for reporting that will create issues for non-European clients. And perhaps the only area where there are, or the two areas where there is insufficient awareness of this are, one, unfortunately, among the clients who will have to get an LEI, and two, among the European regulators who are enforcing it. I think, as Tony said, the FCA is still formally of the view that this is our problem. We just have to talk to our clients and they'll get LEIs. I think at a recent meeting with industry associations, the FCA's comment was that there is nothing prohibiting firms from getting LEIs for their clients. Although, having looked into this internally, the main thing that prohibits that is you basically need a lot of information from your client and your client's permission to act on their behalf, if it's sort of power of attorney from that client, at which point they might as well just apply for the thing anyway themselves and get it over and done with. It's not a practical solution. So, I think this is a big problem for the industry as a whole. It's purely the creation of policymakers. It doesn't realistically serve a market integrity objective. It doesn't serve an investor protection objective. It is an arbitrary choice of a particular data field in reporting that they have insisted on. And it is a mandate that firms not engage in reportable transactions without that information. So to a certain extent, Europe's made a rod for its own back here. And unfortunately, the policymakers and the regulators aren't helping to provide us with the solution.
Just going to add just a very, very quick comment on the back of that, Simon. The whole issue of dual-listed securities is massively controversial at this point. I don't think the policymakers foresaw that. That's an awful lot of, that means basically if you're trading in securities listed in Europe and outside in a third country, there are all kinds of potential implications about the extraterritorial reach of the MiFID trading obligations. So it just goes to show that this is arriving at the same time as the authorities are trying to put equivalent structures in place. They're trying to deal with Brexit at the same time, incidentally, in the European Commission. So I completely concur, Simon. I think the whole third country aspect, it could be the US with research on Rule 28E with the SEC, or the dual listing, which I mentioned before that. That's an unwelcome complication if you're a client of ours, say, for example, and you've got IT people that need to start coding stuff and they need to get to work.
So as I kind of touched on with the intro, the way I look at this, macro and micro impacts of MiFID II. So those macro impacts are really, as touched on there, and that is about the liquidity landscape in equities and how that shifts. A lot of it is focused on the share trading obligations. So brokers operating broker crossing networks today will no longer be able to match client-to-client business on a systematic basis. Okay, meaning that the alternative is for firms like Citi to trade on principal, i.e. providing client liquidity against house flow. So you think about all of the liquidity that's internalized today at firms like Citi. You'll be aware of brands like CitiMatch, MS Pool, Crossfinder, so on and so forth. Those pools, those internal dark pools, will no longer be able to operate as they do today. Equally, as I've described, that business will not all be considered as principal. We won't be able to take all that business on risk, so that business will have to be externalized. Next macro theme around where does that business go? It can go to the public lit venues, and this is an ongoing discussion and touches on some of the points around lack of clarity at the moment. But market makers, electronic market makers, are stepping into this space, putting their hands up and saying, we'll become systematic internalizers ourselves and we'll provide an alternative destination for that business that a firm like Citi is looking to externalize. The parliamentarians have raised a flag on this because that's business they want traded on public lit venues. So that's a big debate. Another macro theme is around the limitations to dark trading on public venues. So you may have heard of the double volume caps, the 4% and 8% caps in dark trading based on the waivers that those dark pools use. What does that mean? It means that business will move to a more block environment because business that is above large in scale, another ESMA requirement based on ADT, if that business is blocky enough, large enough, it's not caught by those double volume caps. So they're the macro themes. The micro themes, very briefly, in no particular order, as I've sort of touched on before, best execution obligations now, not only for sell side, but also buy side. I'm trying to recall the text. We now go from, and I'm sure Arjun will help me out here, from reasonable to substantial.
All sufficient.
Sufficient. Sorry, I knew it had an S. So thank you. Reasonable, sufficient. It is MiFID for dummies. Meaning that now you have to have that best execution policy in place. It's dynamic, and I refer to it as the fire certificate on the wall that you need to monitor and measure. You then have reporting obligations. Again, now for MiFID II, for trade reporting, for example, we go across asset class, more obligation on the buy side, so you can't just simply give it up to the sell side. But in doing so, you still maintain the obligation as the buy side should the sell side get that wrong. Transaction reporting, as we all know, goes from 20 plus fields to 60 plus fields, and all of that personal information, again, in direct conflict with German privacy laws, for example. So how that's going to work, we don't know. And then we move on to research unbundling, and no longer will we be able to bundle both trading and research, and that has to be separated out, and various ramifications for that, particularly in respect to how the market manages their own businesses. And then lastly, there are other impacts on things like high-frequency trading, algorithmic trading, order record keeping, and if not already, buy-side need to be recording telephone conversations. A lot already do, but I've been quite taken aback by how many people are asking me for specific answers to questions on recording of telephone calls, which I didn't think I'd be answering when I left the London Stock Exchange back in July. But there you go. That was probably more than 2 minutes, sorry.
That's okay. Arjun, is anything to
Yeah,
add?
sure. So, as go on.
Of that list, what's your view on which one are we least prepared for?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would, and this is going to be obviously a bit of a generalisation. It's only just now that people are starting to realise about the possible impact to the liquidity landscape. Where am I going to get liquidity under MiFID II? I think that, again, big assumption, I think in the main, the industry has picked up its pace on those direct kind of micro impacts around best execution reporting. I think people are getting their arms around it now. Clearly the devil's in the detail, but for me, it's engaging with clients who clearly have not thought through who their counterparts are, how are they going to do business in the new environment.
Great. Arjun, thank you.
So, we find ourselves in a rather peculiar situation, of course, being a voice-based interdealer broker. And so, come 3rd of Jan, we're going to be operating multiple OTFs and MTFs. So for us, it's, OTFs don't exist. So it's a brand new trading system, it's a brand new trading venue. So it's trying to understand, well, how do we actually structure this voice-based venue? And how are clients going to be interacting with us? So that, of course, is so creating a new entity from scratch that previously had never existed is, of course, a pretty massive challenge. One of the other issues, and James has touched upon it, was how do you maintain global liquidity? And for our case in particular, it's less shares and more for swaps and derivatives. How do you maintain global liquidity for derivatives that are subject to the trading obligation? And there seems to be a lot of noises that the trading obligation for derivatives may actually come in on the 3rd of Jan 2018, which is a bit of a problem because we don't have equivalents with the US or South Korea or Singapore and Australia. And if you are a European entity trading derivatives and swaps, you are not allowed to trade them, well, certain derivatives and swaps, you are not allowed to trade them outside a European trading venue. You can't even trade them on a systematic internalizer, whereas in shares you can. And so it is looking at, well, how do you maintain global liquidity pools for the derivatives market? The issue about legal entity identifiers, is one that, having lobbied on MiFID for a number of years, is one that just simply got through the cracks. Everyone, during the level one negotiations, the industry was focused on a broader, bigger pictures. Well, I say bigger picture. I once spent 6 months lobbying on the deletion of a comma, but we missed LEIs, as it were. There's a reason for the comma, of course. We turn the comma into an or, because if you have a comma, it could be a cumulative test, whereas if you have an or, it means it's an optional test. And so yeah, I know, but that is quite literally the level of detail we went into. So earlier was mentioned that there was some interpretation issues and so on. Well, the industry is equally to blame for some of the complexities in MiFID, because we all lobbied very hard on this and created and made it exceedingly complicated. There are provisions within MiFID that don't agree with each other, and it comes down to the industry equally, and of course the decision makers and policy makers. And I will mention one last thing. One of the biggest issues, of course, facing the industry is how do you structure costs and charges and fees and rate cards going forward that have to be non-discriminatory and have to be publicly available. How do you structure that without it hitting the bottom line, but also without needing to go into endless negotiations with large clients and so on and so forth, and that's something that of course needs to be taken into consideration, and something that the entire industry is working to try to create. This is for the first time that you'll be able to see your competitors' fees and they'll be able to see yours, and this has a direct impacts on P&L.
Great, thank you very much. We've got about 10 minutes left, so...
Sorry, Chad, can I talk a little bit about the buy side, just very, very quickly to answer Nigel's question in terms of big three? So typical medium-sized buy-side firms spending around 10 million, and they're focusing on 3 different breaks in there. James, you mentioned research, costs and charges, as well, Arjun, just now, but firms are really having to make some choice on their research models, equity v debt, different country differences, understanding the quality enhancement test, which models do you pay hard, do you not need research, you have some kind of research payment account. Bottom line is they're going to have to change the way they do business, and the sell side is going to have to accommodate if they provide total waterfront coverage in large cap or small cap equity. We're going to see some reshaping there. Number two is reporting. I mentioned about the fields that need to be captured, whether you're talking trade reporting, transaction reporting, big escalation. Bottom line there, it isn't as simple as picking a vendor who's an approved publication arrangement for a trade report or an approved reporting mechanism for a transaction report. It's getting your data sorted out with your internal environment, and that's what's causing firms a lot of grief there. The third is in execution. Best ex front office controls, particularly as James is saying, non-equity. What regulators are increasingly looking for is the lineage in terms of the indications through the orders into the executions. And also the big shift, MiFID 2 on MiFID 1, this time it's personal. This time you're recording, for instance, who's the name of the portfolio manager. You're recording who's the name of the dealer. Obviously that has a huge bearing, partly because of you're really on point to have to explain what you've been doing, but equally with the general data protection measures to come too. So we're going to see some technology shifts, but like I said, if it's 10 million for a typical mid-sized firm, I'd reckon you're looking at about a 20% cut for those three areas alone.
Thank you, Tony. You're absolutely right. It's a big shift towards personal conduct. So we've asked the audience a question. We had a year's delay. Generally, people think it was essential. I'm going to ask you guys to be quite quick in this one. I'd like to get to question 3 because I think it's what will interest more people. But that year, do you think it was well spent? Do you think we got the value out of it that we could have done? Or do you think people just backed off, reclaimed rolled budget, didn't do as much as they could have done? Do you think the year's delay was for the industry, as it was documented, or was it really for the regulators to get their house in order? So I don't know if anyone would like to talk to that.
I'll chip in with that one. Obviously, we made fantastic use of it, Chad. I made sure of it. No, I think very quickly it was billed as and it was won as a year's delay for the regulators. ESMA actually admitted up front that they needed a year's delay, and as did other European regulators in order to get their own systems in line. Now, given that the technical build that ESMA is looking at is orders of magnitude less complex than the industry are looking at on a firm-by-firm basis, it's a bit cheeky of them to suggest that this was only a problem for regulators, but we'll accept the goodwill with which it was offered, and we got the 12 months. I think the real question now is whether that 12 months was enough. I think there are indications from a lot of European regulators, and indeed from ESMA, that they're still not going to be ready by January. For political reasons, we probably won't get another 12 months from them as a sort of an open public delay. But it does raise the question as to how much forbearance we as an industry can expect when the regulators themselves aren't ready for the go-live date.
James?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I would say from my own experience, my short time at Citi, I think the delay probably wasn't that helpful in sharpening the pencil. I think people did probably take their foot off the gas, as it were. The other thing I think that we do get all a little bit transfixed on, or maybe just me, that January the 3rd is go live and we all need to be ready to go. I think the reality is we're not all going to be ready to go. I think this is going to be a slow burn into the next 12 months, 2 years. We're already seeing language like best endeavours in the ESMA Q&A in respect to things like best execution. First best execution report is to be published at the end of April next year to reflect 2017. And we know that a lot of people don't even have access to that data in order to provide that report. So that's just another example. We've already seen a delay to the SI regime in terms of the quantitative measures. Arjun alluded to a possible delay to the trading obligation for derivatives, which I think the industry is sort of campaigning for. So maybe we can sleep a little bit easier, not on the basis that Jan 3rd is not going to be a life or death situation. But other than the fact that we all needed a little bit more time, from my perspective, I think if you delay things further, it just gives people more excuse not to actually get on and get this stuff over the line.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on to the third question. I think it's probably a little bit more engaging for the audience to get your views on what are the opportunities, who makes money out of this. I'd probably ask Arjun first, from an ICAP perspective, is this a good thing or is it really a bit of a nuisance?
Well, as far as TPI cap is concerned, I mean, MiFID is helpful, particularly in comparison with the CEF, in that MiFID explicitly acknowledges voice execution and brings voice in within a regulated framework and provides a structure around it. So in that way, MiFID is helpful for the particular circumstances in which TPI cap finds itself, and of course our competitors. As far as the rest of the industry is concerned, if you're, I mean, I used to be on the buy side for quite some time, and for those on the buy side, it's a bit of a nuisance more than I think it will pay, to be honest. I mean, there's the transparency requirements, although not necessarily affecting an asset manager's bottom line, it does affect the returns that they are able to generate for their funds, which could lead to redemptions, which then hits the bottom line. And for the vendors, etc. I mean, Christmas has come early. For investment consultants, Christmas has come early. So it depends on where you are.
Tony, do you have any thoughts? You obviously talked to a lot of people.
Violently agree. I think that's right. I didn't mean advisory consultant. But I think the winners are going to be the technology intermediators. What's fascinating at the earlier question was, what did we do about the year's delay? It was a gift, actually, to many of us who could take our eye off the business as usual and start future scoping and actually imagining what a world of analytics or robot process automation or smart contract distributed ledger. It was a really great year spent with Innovate Finance and all kinds of things, and some very grown-up discussions, some of which involved the buy side in terms of what they should be doing, in terms of interacting in some of these spaces. We're now back in, obviously, implementation territory, and I think the folks are going to win. I mentioned some of the sort of providers, so transaction cost analysis providers. In fact, Liz Callahan of ICMA deserves a lot of credit for this, because she put a paper out last year where she was talking about the different subcategories. IT tools, internalized engines, information networks. I think there's going to be an awful lot of very interesting possibilities, which has got to be good for the industry. They'll shake out, just like we saw with MiFID 1. So if I look at the number of providers, there was a natural culling, I suppose, over time. The question I ask, though, from a buy-side perspective, is whether end investors are better served by more complexity. That's the thing that does worry me. Does it mean better alpha decisioning? Does it mean that some investment managers will seek different styles, like direct lending, for example, or portable alpha, smart beta, these kinds of things? But what MiFID 2 does at least do is, because of all the transparency and the possibility of price comparisons, it does force firms to think outside the box and figure out whether they want to do things a little bit differently.
Thank you. We could go on for ages. They've run out of water, probably. If you'd like to continue the debate, we do have our regulations working group that's open to all members to join. Actively encourage, get in touch with us via the website or how you've been contacted for the event, and we can hook you up with that regulations working group. Thank you very much to the panelists. It's been a great conversation.